At the far end of a Philadelphia estate sale, Nora Bell found a baby who looked terrified in a room where everyone else was smiling. The photograph was more than 100 years old, a formal parlor portrait, a wealthy husband, a silk-dressed wife, a child in white lace sitting on her mother's lap. Nothing about it should have felt dangerous. But Nora had restored enough old photographs to know the difference between a blurred infant and a frightened one. This baby was not squinting. She was not startled by the flash. She was not looking at the camera at all. Her eyes were locked on something just outside the frame. And the longer Nora stared at that tiny face, the more certain she became of one terrible thing. Someone in that room had already taught the child to be afraid. The portrait was lying inside a cracked leather writing box at a brownstone liquidation near Rittenhouse Square. The house had belonged to the Whitmore family, one of those old Philadelphia names that appeared on brass plaques, hospital wings, and buildings no living person could afford. Most of the buyers moved quickly through the parlor, hunting for silver, lamps, signed books, anything with a clean price and an easy resale. Nora moved slower. She owned a small photograph restoration shop in Old City, and her eye was trained to pause where other people glanced. A chipped daguerreotype, a torn cabinet card, a faded family portrait with one face scratched out. Those were the pieces that usually had secrets. The portrait in the leather box had been wrapped in yellowed tissue and tucked beneath a stack of calling cards. The silver frame was missing one corner. The glass was bubbled from age, but the image itself was sharp. The man in the photograph sat stiffly in a dark three-piece suit. His hair was parted with surgical precision. One hand rested on a carved chair arm, the other disappeared just beyond the edge of the image. His wife sat beside him in a high-collared cream dress, one hand curved protectively around the baby's waist. And the baby ruined the lie. She was maybe 5 months old, a soft face, dark little curls, a christening gown with hand-tatted lace down the front. But her mouth was slightly open, her fingers were clenched, her eyes had the fixed, exhausted dread of someone waiting for pain. Nora turned the frame toward the estate manager. "How much for this?" The woman barely looked up. $20. "Frame is damaged." Nora paid without bargaining. By the time she got back to her shop, the December light had gone blue over the brick streets. She locked the door, cleared her work table, and eased the photograph from its broken frame. Old photographs often hid their real story on the back: names, dates, studio stamps. A note from someone who thought the future might need help. This one had all three. Embossed in the lower corner was the mark of Vail & Sons Portrait Rooms, Walnut Street, Philadelphia. Beneath it, in faded ink, October 3, 1911. And under that, written in a woman's smaller hand, Arthur, Marion, and little Rose Whitmore. Nora whispered the baby's name once. Rose. Then she noticed something else. A faint brown crescent near the edge of the backing board, not on the photograph, but pressed into the paper that had sealed it inside the frame. It looked like the mark left by a thumb, or Nora almost dismissed it. Then when she remembered the baby's eyes, not the mark, not the damaged frame, the eyes. That night, she searched the city archives until the shop windows turned black around her. Arthur Whitmore was easy to find. He was a coal broker with investments in rail lines and shipping contracts. Society pages called him disciplined. Business notices called him shrewd. Obituaries would later call him a patron of medicine, charity, and civic progress. Marion Ashby Whitmore came from a quieter kind of money. Her father owned textile mills outside Lancaster. Her wedding announcement described her as delicate in constitution, which in 1911 usually meant a woman was expected to suffer politely. Then Nora found the line that made her sit back from the screen. Rose Whitmore died on October 29, 1911, 26 days after the portrait was taken. Cause of death: infant collapse following convulsions. Not unusual enough to shock a doctor in that era. Not clear enough to demand an investigation. Not in a family wealthy enough to be questioned. Nora kept reading. The Whitmores had lost another child 2 years earlier, a son named Edward, 8 months old. Failure to thrive. 2 babies, both dead before their first birthday. Both in a house with money, doctors, nurses, and no shortage of food. Nora printed the records and laid them beside the portrait. The parents smiled in the photograph as if the room were safe. Rose did not. The next morning, Nora carried the portrait to Dr. Miriam Klein, a photographic historian at the University of Pennsylvania, who had spent 30 years studying early 20th century studio work. Miriam's office smelled faintly of dust, linen gloves, and old chemistry. She did not say much at first. She placed the portrait under a conservation lamp, adjusted a magnifier, and bent over the baby's face. "That is not a normal infant gaze," she said. Nora felt her stomach tighten. "So I'm not imagining it." "No." Miriam kept studying the print. "At 5 months, a baby can fix on movement, light, a voice, a familiar person. But look at the eyes. She is not tracking the photographer. She is looking low and to the right." Miriam shifted the lamp. "And there is another problem." "What problem?" "The studio light is wrong." Nora leaned closer. Miriam pointed with a capped pencil. Vale's studio used a large north window and a white canvas reflector. Soft, even light. You can see it on the mother's dress, but the baby's pupils catch a second highlight. Small, hard, lower than the camera. A lamp, possibly. Or a polished object. Something close enough to hold her attention. Miriam looked up. Whatever it was, she recognized it. Those words stayed with Nora as she walked back through the cold. She began with the studio. Vale and Sons had closed in 1938, but a portion of the family archive had been donated to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. The appointment took 2 days to arrange, 2 days in which Nora read everything she could find about the Whitmore household. The picture grew stranger. Arthur had taken out new insurance policies in 1909, first on his son Edward, then on Rose after her birth. At the time, child policies were small compared with adult policies, but they could cover burial costs and debts quietly. They also normalized the unthinkable. Marion had been admitted twice to a private sanatorium in Bryn Mawr for nervous agitation. The dates mattered, once after Edward's death, once shortly before Rose was born. In November 1911, 3 weeks after Rose died, the Whitmore house on Spruce Street was sold in a private transaction for far less than its value. Marion disappeared from society pages. Arthur did not. He traveled. Invested. Donated money to a children's ward. A children's ward. Nora read that line 3 times. Then she found the house. The Spruce Street mansion still existed, divided into 3 apartments behind a restored brick facade and black iron railings. The top 2 floors were owned by Dr. Anika Rao, a pediatric toxicologist at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, who had purchased the unit because of its original nursery windows. When Nora called, she expected caution. Instead, Dr. Rao went silent. Then she said, "You found the portrait." Nora gripped the phone tighter. "You know about it?" "I know about the room." Dr. Rao met her at the front door the next evening. The old mansion was warmer inside than Nora expected. Much of it had been renovated, but the bones remained. Tall ceilings, pocket doors, carved stair rails polished by hands long dead. The former parlor faced the street. Nora held up the photograph and aligned the background with the room. The fireplace, the window, the carved molding, the angle of the chair. "This is it," she said quietly. Dr. Rao nodded. "And the nursery was upstairs." They climbed 2 flights to a room now used as an office. It had pale walls, bookshelves, and a desk facing a tall window, but one section near the closet had been preserved under glass. Original wallpaper, tiny blue flowers on cream paper, and near the lower edge a cluster of faint brown stains. Nora did not speak. Dr. Rao did. "When I renovated, I found the old wallpaper under 3 later layers. The stains were near where a crib would have stood. I had them tested because I work with toxins, and because I am apparently the kind of person who cannot leave a dead room alone." "What were they?" "Traces consistent with paregoric and chloral hydrate." The words landed like a key in a lock. Paregoric was an opium tincture. Chloral hydrate was a sedative. Both were available in the early 1900s. Both could quiet a crying child. Both could kill one. Dr. Rao opened a folder on her desk. "The previous owner gave me a box of things found in the basement. Most of it was trash. Receipts, broken curtain hooks, a school primer. But there was one letter." She laid it on the desk. The paper had been folded so many times the creases were almost cuts. The date read November 2nd, 9/11, 4 days after Rose died. The letter was from Marion Whitmore to her older sister Clara. Nora read it with gloved hands. My dearest Clara, I cannot remain in this house. Rose is gone, and they say again that God has made his will known, but I do not believe God keeps his bottles locked in Arthur's desk. I found the spoon hidden behind the medical books. The same narrow spoon I saw after Edward began sleeping so heavily. Arthur says I am unwell. He says grief has made me cruel, but Rose knew him. I saw it in her face when he came near. On the day of the portrait, she looked toward him as if she were begging me to understand. I did not understand quickly enough. Nora's hands went still. Dr. Rao's voice softened. There's more. From the same box, she removed a small envelope. Inside was a tarnished silver infant spoon, narrow and shallow, its handle engraved with the letter R. Rose. Nora stared at it. The object was smaller than she expected. That made it worse. Arthur Whitmore had not needed a weapon anyone would fear. He needed a respectable bottle, a nursery spoon, a doctor willing to sign what rich grief told him to sign. At the Historical Society, the Vale and Sons archive waited in gray boxes under fluorescent lights. The archivist, Mr. Hollis, pulled the 1911 studio ledger and turned to October. There, he said, Whitmore Arthur H., wife and infant daughter. Formal parlor portrait. Home sitting, Nora leaned over the page. The technical notes were precise. North window, white reflector. Additional polished lamp, requested by Mr. W. Infant. Unsettled. Mrs. W. distressed. Mr. W. impatient. Then the handwriting changed as if the photographer had pressed harder. Personal note. Child reacts strongly when father stands to right of camera. Mrs. W. refuses to let father hold infant. Father insists on final family plate. Baby's expression severe. Unusual fear response for age. Nora looked at Hollis. Is there anything else? He hesitated. There are unused plates. The glass negatives were stored separately, wrapped in paper sleeves. Most were damaged. 2 were not. Under the viewing light, the first negative showed the same portrait Nora had bought. The second made the room go quiet. It captured the moment just before the final pose. Marion was leaning away from Arthur, clutching Rose against her chest. Arthur stood half outside the frame, one hand extended low toward the baby. In that hand was the little silver spoon. The hard second highlight in Rose's pupils was not a lamp. It was the spoon catching the studio light. That was what she had been staring at. Not the camera. Not a stranger. Not some vague shadow in the room. The spoon. The thing that made her sleep too deeply. The thing that came before pain. The thing her mother had not yet been able to prove. Nora had restored thousands of damaged images, but she had never felt a photograph become evidence in her hands. The next weeks turned the secret into a chain. Dr. Rao reviewed the symptoms listed on the death certificates. Convulsions, shallow breathing, limpness, unexplained sleep, failure to thrive. None proved murder by themselves. Together they made a pattern. Miriam Klein authenticated the photograph and the studio notes. The Historical Society digitized the unused negative. Nora traced Marion's family line to Clara's descendants in Maine. That was where the final piece had been waiting. A retired school librarian named Helen Ashby answered Nora's letter with a sentence that made her stop breathing. I wondered when someone would finally ask about Rose. Helen arrived in Philadelphia carrying a wooden recipe box tied with string. Inside were no recipes, there were diary pages. Marion had mailed them to Clara in pieces between 1911 and 1914. Hiding the truth in envelopes marked household accounts. The entry for the day of the portrait was written in dark, uneven ink. October 3, 1911. Arthur demanded the picture be taken, though Rose has had another of those terrible sleeping spells. I begged to postpone. He said I had made this family a subject of whispering once and would not do so again. Mr. Vale was kind. He saw that Rose became frightened whenever Arthur came near. When Arthur held the little spoon to quiet her, Rose stared at it with such terror that I felt ashamed to have missed what my own child knew. I asked for a plate with only Rose and me. Arthur refused. He said a family portrait requires a family. But we are not a family. We are a room arranged around a danger no one is allowed to name. Nora had to lower the page. Helen looked across the table. My grandmother said Marion never forgave herself. What happened to her? She left 2 days after writing the letter. Arthur threatened to have her committed. Clara hid her in Maine until the lawyers settled a separation quietly. And Arthur? Helen's expression hardened. He remarried. Nora already knew enough about stories like this to dread the next sentence. Arthur Whitmore married Beatrice Leland in 1916, a widow with a 6-year-old daughter and a considerable trust. The daughter, June, died the following winter after a sudden respiratory illness. Beatrice died in 1919 after what the newspapers called a decline of spirits. Arthur inherited enough to retire from the coal trade before 45. He spent the rest of his life on boards, committees, and charity panels, always near institutions that praised him for his concern toward vulnerable children. No one had ever charged him. No one had ever accused him in public. The dead children had been buried under soft medical words, and the living women had been dismissed under harder ones. Nervous, delicate, unwell, hysterical. A century had passed, but the system around Arthur still looked familiar to Nora. Not because the clothes were the same, not because the medicine was the same, but because respectability had done what it often does. It had lowered its voice around power. Nora took everything to the Philadelphia Police Department's cold case liaison, a woman named Detective Ruth Alvarez, who listened without interrupting. The detective knew there would be no courtroom. Arthur Whitmore had been dead since 1942. The doctors were dead. The witnesses were dead. Even the house had been carved into modern square footage. But a case did not need prosecution to matter. Sometimes it needed a name corrected, a file amended, a museum label written in a way that did not let murder pass as tragedy. Detective Alvarez studied the portrait for a long time. Then she said, "The child is telling us where to look." That became the line the newspapers used when the Historical Society opened its exhibition months later. The portrait of Arthur, Marion, and Rose Whitmore hung beside the unused glass negative. The spoon, Marion's letters, and the diary pages. Visitors came expecting a ghost story. What they found was worse. A room full of ordinary objects that had once protected an extraordinary cruelty. A studio portrait, a nursery spoon, a death certificate, a husband's reputation, a mother's dismissed fear. One evening, after the exhibit closed, Nora stood alone in front of the enlarged portrait. Rose's eyes were no longer a mystery. They were a map. They crossed 115 years, past the photographer, past the doctor, past the newspapers, past every polite sentence that had tried to cover the truth. Marion's final letter was displayed in a quiet case at the end of the room. She had written it in 1956, 5 years before her death, and sealed it with Clara's papers. To whoever one day believes my daughter, I have lived long enough to learn that truth is not always buried because no one sees it. Sometimes it is buried because the person who sees it is not allowed to be believed. Rose saw him before I did. Her brother Edward may have seen him too. I loved my children. I failed to save them. But I did not fail to remember. If this letter is being read, then my baby's fear has outlived the man who caused it. Please let her be more than the child in a sad old picture. Let her be the witness they refuse to hear. Nora read those words until the glass reflected her own face over Marion's handwriting. Then she looked back at Rose. The baby in the portrait had not been silent. The room had simply been too respectable to listen.